Kia ora, everybody. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you for tuning in to this speech on forecasting at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, charting the way forward. I'm probably going to speak, first of all, I'm Paul Conway, Chief Economist here at the RB. I'm going to speak for, 25 minutes or so, and then I think we've got a 45-minute session altogether, so we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end of me speaking. So questions as they come up. I think there's a sort of slot on your screen there, so type your questions into that slot and we'll see how many of those we can get through after the speech. Now, I think it's serendipitous, really, to be doing a speech on forecasting 2 weeks after the US imposed sweeping tariffs on its trading partners and then partially at least paused them for 90 days. It's sort of been hard enough keeping up with the slew of announcements coming out of the US administration this last couple of weeks, never mind trying to figure out what it all means for the New Zealand economy. But that's part of our job here at the Reserve Bank, and we are well into our work. So I thought I would start just by reiterating some of the key messages from our April monetary policy review that came out last week. And those key messages are that higher tariffs and uncertainty about global trade policy mean that economic activity globally and in New Zealand will most likely be weaker than expected. So a big focus on uncertainty. It's not just the fact of these trade barriers being put in place, but it's the fact of sort of not knowing what the sort of final landscape looks like now. That's having a negative effect on economic growth globally and here in New Zealand. Second key point is that at this stage, the likely impacts of trade barriers, tariffs, etc., on inflation in New Zealand are more ambiguous. But the balance of risks has shifted to the downside. That was the consensus view across the Monetary Policy Committee. Third key point, we also noted that we've got good scope to lower the OCR further as appropriate as the impacts of tariffs on medium-term inflation pressures in New Zealand become clearer. We're also doing a heap of work from here on in that we'll sort of be talking about tariffs obviously in the May monetary policy statement. Happy to talk about that sort of forward-looking agenda if anyone is interested. Maybe we can do that in the Q&A. But let's get on with the speech. In the meantime, so I am going to talk about how we forecast as part of our monetary policy decision-making process here at the RB, because knowing the current state of the economy and where it is likely headed are key to making interest rate decisions today that keep inflation low and stable in future. Now, given all the uncertainty that we face, forecasting, it's a critical tool for guiding monetary policy decisions. Also plays an essential role in shaping people's expectations of where the economy's headed, particularly inflation expectations, and also ensuring transparency and accountability, etc., etc. So it's a complex but an essential part of monetary policy making. I also want to make the point that our forecasting approach, it's continuously evolving as we learn more about the economy and develop new tools through our ongoing research program and our modelling work, both of which are very much up and running and firing and producing very valuable insights for us currently. We publish a lot on that, and we've got a lot of publications coming up over the remainder of this year. The pipeline is very much full. But I do think that piecing all of that together and figuring out what it means for how we forecast, it can be difficult. And I think our approach is not particularly well understood by some people out there. And I sort of say that based on, I see a bit of misinformation coming through the media from time to time on how we do forecasts. There's been the odd op-ed that is so wrong in so many ways that we thought it was important to sort of just have a bit of a refresher on how we forecast, forecasting 101, if you like. So this speech, and we're also releasing a few other papers alongside it, our aim is to improve understanding of why and how we forecast and how certain aspects of our forecast should be understood. So as I mentioned, we're releasing some new work alongside the speech. A lot of the speech is a bit of a refresher on how we forecast and figure out what to do with the official cash rate. But the other work includes a bulletin article that goes into more detail of how we forecast, Forecasting 201, I guess, and we're also putting out 2 analytical notes that outline how we nowcast, and I'll talk about what that is. How we nowcast 4 important macro variables: investment, residential investment, house prices, and GDP growth. Just on GDP growth, we're also launching what we're calling Kiwi GDP on our website. So this is a live nowcast of New Zealand's GDP growth in the current quarter. So we're going to update that every week, and we hope that it's a useful complement to existing models out there that nowcast GDP growth in New Zealand. Okay, so there are 3 aspects, or 4 aspects actually, that I want to focus on, different aspects of forecasting. First is the importance of forecasting within our flexible inflation targeting framework. Second is how we make forecasts for the economic starting point. So where's the economy at in the current quarter? That's nowcasting. And then I'm going to talk about how we forecast further out into the future. And third, I'm going to talk about how our forecast for the official cash rate should be interpreted, conditional being the key word there. And fourthly, I'll also briefly talk about the benefits of publishing a set of forecasts, including for the official cash rate, putting out a forward-looking track for all of that. There's a few key messages that we're hoping you'll get from this speech. First of all, we use masses of data and empirical techniques to nowcast the starting point of for our economic projections and for our monetary policy decisions. So this is all about where is the economy now, today. Second key point, forecasting further into the future. It's less about synthesizing current data, very difficult to get data on the future, and it's more about understanding structural relationships in the economy and how economic events are likely to play out into the future. I also want to make the point that our actual forecasts, so what we publish in the monetary policy statement, they are model supported, they are not model driven. So, there are people in the mix. We've got seasoned, experienced economists to, amazing, very skilled grads in the economics department, and the people aspect is vital in all of this. And last key point on the OCR forecasts, they're conditional on the full economic outlook. So as the outlook changes, we adjust our OCR forecast such that inflation still converges to the 2% midpoint of our 1 to 3% target range. So when the facts change, we change our minds. Okay, so let's start with a few words on what forecasting is in the context of our inflation targeting framework. So to begin at the beginning, the best contribution that monetary policy can make to the long-run material well-being of New Zealanders is to deliver stable prices, low and stable inflation. The framework that we use to deliver price stability is called flexible inflation targeting, and within this framework our job is to deliver CPI inflation between 1 and 3% with a focus on the 2% target midpoint. Now the flexible bit in there, it allows us to deliver price stability while minimising unnecessary volatility in the broader economy and financial system. So this is a good thing. It would be economically destabilising of us to inflexibly bring inflation back to target within, say, a few months every time we were hit by new economic events or shocks. So being flexible, it means that inflation, it's not always going to be at the target midpoint, or in some cases it's not going to be within the target range, although I've got to say it's great to have inflation close to that target midpoint currently. Now there's another F word that we need to add to this framework, that is we are flexible inflation forecast targeters. So we need that additional F word because changes in the OCR affect inflation with so-called long and variable lags. We change the OCR today, it influences inflation in future. So there is a forward-looking element to us achieving our remit. Now we focus on controlling inflation over the medium term, and generally we regard that to be between 1 and 3 years ahead. It's a bit like football. Chris Wood, he doesn't waste energy chasing the ball all over the field. Instead, he anticipates where the ball is going to be rather than where it just was. And that's what we do. We look ahead and we see where the economy is going and we anticipate because the economic effects of interest rate decisions made today play out over the next few years. That's how we control inflation, and that's how Chris Wood scores lots of goals. Very excited to be using a football analogy. Anyway, a lot goes into making this flexible inflation forecast targeting framework work for New Zealanders. We need good research and modelling to understand how the New Zealand economy works and the likely future effects of economic events, including changes in interest rates, how that affects people's decisions, households and businesses. We also need good data and analysis to understand the starting point for our economic projections, and we need good strategies and good policy advice to help the Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, to make the right decisions. Now, does all of that, like we've got all of that, does that mean that we get it exactly perfectly right every time? Of course not. Our data and our analytical tools and models are imperfect. And it's simply not possible to forecast how black swan events such as pandemics and trade wars will exactly play out. But we are back every 6 weeks or so to update and share our views. So monetary policy, it's a repeat game, and we learn and we adjust as we go. All right, so let's talk a little bit about nowcasting, which is all about understanding the present so that we can predict the future. So I want to focus on understanding the starting point of the economy as part of our forecasting process. Because if we don't know where we are now, it's much harder to know where we are going and how to set the OCR today consistent with low and stable inflation in future. Unfortunately, it's not easy for us to have an accurate view of where the economy stands today, even though it sounds like it should be. Unlike weather forecasters who can, at least look out the window to see if it's raining, as well as using very sophisticated technologies as well. Official economic data, it often arrives with a significant lag, and it's often revised. For example, we receive GDP data about 3 months after the end of the relevant quarter, by which time the economy has already moved forward. So we use a technique that's called nowcasting to assess where the economy is, well, now. So nowcasting, it uses a vast array of timely data. So this is data from business surveys, financial markets, consumer spending, traffic movements, internet search trends, etc., to estimate current economic conditions well before the official numbers are released. So nowcasting, it allows us to assess economic conditions almost in real time, or at least more real time than what we get with the official data. And that can be especially important in times of heightened economic uncertainty when rapid changes in the economy might require a swift and agile response from monetary policy. It's very important that we understand where we are at today. Now, if I made all of that sound easy, I really didn't mean to. There are complex statistical issues that need to be addressed with building good nowcasting models and frameworks, and have a look at the 2 analytical notes that we're releasing alongside this speech to get a sense of that. But very briefly, economic data, it's reported at different intervals. So we've got daily data, weekly data, monthly data, quarterly data, even annual data, although that's less about nowcasting, the annual bit. And our nowcasting models, they need to integrate these mixed frequencies to construct a coherent picture of current economic activity. Different data sets also become available at different times over the relevant quarter. So our nowcasting models, they continuously update the nowcast or the forecast as new information arrives. So this means that a nowcast for the given quarter evolves as more and more data becomes available over the quarter and are incorporated. The other challenging thing with nowcasting, high frequency data, it's typically quite volatile. And we need our models and our expert judgment to sort of help filter out some of that noise. Now, importantly, we don't rely on just one single model to nowcast the economy. We use different models, and each of those has their own strengths and weaknesses. So we combine the insights from multiple approaches to produce our best possible estimates of where the economy is at today. Some of these nowcasting frameworks, we're publishing a couple of papers with some very slick technology around nowcasting, but we have been using this approach. We've been using nowcasting frameworks at the Reserve Bank for many years. Okay. as I mentioned earlier, we are publishing the output from one of these models. We're calling it Kiwi GDP, along with the speech for the nerds out there. I'm very fond of nerds. I work with many nerds, actually. Kiwi GDP, it's a dynamic factor model. It's a lot like the one published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So it uses a broad range of economic data as they are released to update a nowcast of the unreleased GDP growth rate for the current quarter, and we're going to update that each week on our website to reflect the data that has come out that week. So hopefully that's going to be a useful complement. There's a couple of other models out there that nowcast GDP growth. Now the final point I want to make around nowcasting is that our short-term forecasts are model supported. They are not model driven. So yes, we use sophisticated empirical techniques and that forms the backbone of our approach, but experienced economists play a vital role in creating our nowcasts, and the team draw on their knowledge of the model's limitations, wealth of sort of alternative off-model data, and also our research and industry insights also feed into improving the results coming out of our nowcasting model. So machines cannot do everything yet, at least. Okay, so now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about nowcasting versus forecasting. Nowcasting, it's all about assessing economic conditions in the very near term. That's usually the quarter that we were in, or that we are in. As we look further into the future, it's less about current data and it's more about understanding structural relationships in the economy and how economic events are likely to play out. So we have a Workhorse forecasting model. We call it NZSIM, the New Zealand Structural Inflation Model. And again, for the nerds, I guess, it's a semi-structural dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. And it brings together our research on how the New Zealand economy works, including the effects of monetary policy on household and firm behaviour. So as a bit of research comes out of the production line, we're always comparing that to sort of how NZSIM operates and using it to improve that Workhorse model in one way or another. I also want to make the point that our medium-term forecasts, they're also model supported rather than model driven. NZSIM, it's an amazing tool. It provides us with a rigorous economic foundation, but it's really all about expert judgment. That remains essential. So in essence, we use NZSIM to structure our insights that are coming out of staff, the economics department, more broadly across the bank, from committee members around the MPC table, and NZSIM allows us to structure that into a consistent medium-term outlook for the New Zealand economy. So, as I mentioned, it's a very handy piece of monetary policy infrastructure. Now, it's this blend of quantitative analysis and expert insights that ensures our forecasts are timely and robust and give MPC a clear, more comprehensive view of the economic outlook. All right, I want to sort of briefly chat or clarify how to think about our OCR forecasts, and the banner here is that it's conditional on the rest of the economic outlook. So I want to clarify how our OCR forecast should be interpreted. It's as we're one of the few central banks globally that, as part of our flexible inflation forecast targeting approach, we publish what we call an endogenous policy interest rate track. So this is an interest rate track that's consistent with the rest of our projection, and we do that every 3 months in our monetary policy statements. Now, this is our best estimate of how the official cash rate will need to change, will need to evolve over the forecast period to meet our inflation objective, conditional on the economic outlook. Now, that last bit, conditional on the economic outlook, that should be read as being bolded. In fact, I think it is bolded in the print version of the speech. It should be highlighted. I'm not sure if we went that far, and it should be jumping off the page like a neon sign. Obviously, that's not possible with current technology, but I cannot overstate the importance of this conditionality. If the economic outlook changes, which it almost always does to some degree between our projections, then our projection for the OCR will change. Because the OCR is conditional. The projection of the OCR is conditional on everything else in the economy evolving as expected. So it should almost never be interpreted as a guarantee of future MPC decisions. Now you can see this there's a few graphs in the speech. You can see this in terms of how our projections change through time. So the outlook for the OCR, it's always determined such that the MPC meets its inflation target over the medium term. So our inflation forecasts pretty much always settle close to that 2% target midpoint by the end of the projection period. There is a graph in the speech showing inflation almost always returning to 2% over the projection horizon. Not sure we're going to put that up, or it might be up, I don't know. Anyway, if this wasn't the case, if we didn't have inflation returning to 2%, if it didn't settle at that target midpoint, then our forecasts, would imply, or they could imply, that the monetary policy is not being set appropriately to meet our inflation target. So our forecast for inflation almost always converge to that 2%. But our forecast for the OCR, that's what changes significantly through time, and that's the second graph in the speech there. So broadly speaking, it's changes in our outlook for the official cash rate that tell you whether underlying inflationary pressures in the economy have changed or not. So you'll sometimes, for example, hear us talking about a significant change in inflationary pressures, but our forecast for inflation looks more or less the same as it did in the previous statement. In this case, we've shifted our outlook for the OCR to offset the change in inflationary pressures, and in so doing, that leaves the outlook for inflation broadly unchanged. So for example, if our OCR track is higher than it was in the last projection, then it signifies our view, the view of the committee, is that underlying inflationary pressures in the economy have increased, and vice versa. If the OCR is a bit lower, then inflation pressures have reduced a bit. Okay, so that's a bit on nowcasting, it's a bit on forecasting, it's a bit on how to understand our OCR forecasts. I want to end with a few words on, why do we go to the trouble of publishing forecasts, including for the official cash rate in the first place. And in short, well, obviously, we do forecasting because it's an invaluable guide to our internal decision making. But our economic forecasts also improve transparency, they improve accountability, and ultimately they improve the effectiveness of monetary policy. So let's start with enhanced transparency and accountability from publishing forecasts. So we are operationally independent to formulate and implement monetary policy. So in order to preserve our social license, which is something we take very seriously, we need to be transparent in communicating our monetary policy strategy and decisions. So regularly presenting MPC's policy strategy and the forecasts and judgments that lie in behind it, that enhances our accountability to the public and to the government. So publishing an OCR track that reflects MPC's policy strategy, it also increases the clarity in our communication. A picture speaks 1,000 words. So our OCR projection tells a large part of the policy story. Our forecasts, they're also useful when we look back and assess how monetary policy decisions have turned out. And we're doing that all the time. We do that to learn from our recent experience, our previous experience. So we regularly assess how accurate our forecast has been or have been, and also the factors that have driven any errors in our forecasts. And what we learn from this evaluation of our forecast, it feeds into our research program. Where can we dig a bit deeper? What can we know in more detail that would get rid of those forecast errors in the first place? Because learning from our forecasting mistakes, ultimately it improves our decision-making processes and our understanding of the economy. Okay, enhanced policy effectiveness. So, as well as improving our transparency and accountability, regularly publishing economic projections also makes it clear to the public that the Monetary Policy Committee are conducting monetary policy to achieve price stability. I think that's sort of, this is well understood out there, which is great. We've been doing this for 35 years now. So if people understand that monetary policy, that the objective is to control medium-term inflation, keep it around that 2% number, this helps anchor people's inflation expectations to the midpoint of that target range. And that's key in maintaining low and stable inflation over the medium term. Expectations should be glued to 2. Our forecasts, they also influence wholesale and retail interest rates in the economy and help ensure that interest rates move to levels consistent with price stability in between meetings, even before we sort of get out there and do our thing on where the economy's at and what needs to happen with the OCR. So our OCR projections, they give financial markets greater clarity on how we plan to meet our commitment to price stability. So publishing an endogenous OCR track, an OCR track that's consistent with the rest of our projections, it also clarifies how the MPC respond to new information. So it makes what we call our reaction function clearer to financial market participants and the public more generally. So if we do a good job of that, then financial market participants, they'll adjust their OCR expectations and financial conditions more broadly as new information becomes available. So financial conditions, they often adjust in ways that are consistent with maintaining low and stable inflation, even before we publish our updated forecasts, and that makes monetary policy more effective. And there's a graph of that in the speech as well. It compares actual changes in our OCR projections with changes in market pricing for the OCR through time. And it shows that market-driven changes in the outlook for the OCR, they're often very much consistent with MPC-driven changes in the OCR. So this means that market participants have correctly anticipated how the MPC will respond to new events. All right, thank you for all of that. Just to conclude, to sum it up, monetary policy takes time to affect the economy, so we need to look ahead to decide how to respond today. So it follows, it's sort of natural that forecasting sits at the heart of how we set monetary policy. By embedding forecasting within our flexible inflation targeting framework, we ensure that monetary policy decisions support medium-term price stability and the well-being of New Zealanders. Of course, economic data, it's far from ideal, so nowcasting is an important part of forecasting. It improves our understanding of the present and thereby enhances the accuracy of our broader economic forecast to help us make better informed policy decisions. It's challenging, forecasting is challenging and subject to uncertainty, but it's an essential tool for shaping expectations, guiding policy decisions and maintaining economic stability. By clearly communicating our conditional forecasts, we enhance transparency, accountability and the effectiveness of monetary policy. Doing that requires models, lots of data, lots of analysis and lots of expert judgment to anticipate future economic conditions so that we get OCR settings today right. And lastly, forecasts, they're never perfect, but they do provide a structured way to think about the economy's future path and guide monetary policy decisions. The forecasts, they're always conditional. If the facts change, we may need to change our minds so that we're always getting inflation back to target, or pushing it in that direction, consistent with our purpose of enhancing the well-being and prosperity of New Zealanders. And that's it from me in terms of the speech. So thank you for that. Hopefully we've got some questions. Let's do a bit of Q&A. James, over to you.
To kick off, Paul, how are you going forecasting the impacts of the trade war currently going on?
That's a good question, very timely, very topical. Obviously the increase in trade barriers, it's, as I said in the speech, it's sort of been a bit of a moving feast. It's sort of hard to get a handle on it. I think just to sort of summarise what we've done so far, in the February monetary policy statement, we sort of outlined a conceptual framework for thinking about how trade protectionism, in quotes, protectionism sounds like a nice word, but there's nothing sort of nice in terms of trade barriers. How's that going to sort of wash up on the New Zealand economy? And we talked about the trade channel, and we talked, trade diversion. It could mean that our imports coming into New Zealand become a bit cheaper, or it could mean increased demand for our exports. All of that sounds good, but offsetting that through the trade channel, New Zealand exporters will be trading into a global economy that isn't growing as quickly as it would have been without the trade barriers, so weaker global demand, and also a global economy that's less efficient. Because global supply chains are having to sort of reconfigure themselves, avoiding the US more than they were previously. So there's an efficiency cost there. And we also talked about the effects of a trade war on the sort of financial channel. So this is exchange rates, longer term interest rates, and asset prices, which has very much been in play over the last couple of weeks. Finally, the fourth channel there, we talked about uncertainty, and I sort of mentioned in the speech how pernicious that policy uncertainty can be. And then I've already spoken to the key messages that we put out there in the April Monetary Policy Review released last week. Downside to growth, downside risks to inflation, scope to lower interest rates if necessary, depending on how it plays out. In terms of what we're doing looking forward, we've got a very sort of state-of-the-art global macro model in-house. We've recently sort of onboarded it, and it's very proficient at sort of figuring out what this disruption in trade is going to mean for the global economy, the sort of channels through which it works. And we've split New Zealand out, so we've got New Zealand as a separate country in this global model, which it wasn't previously. It's called G cubed for people with an interest out there. So essentially, that's going to tell us a lot about how the trade diversion is going to work in practice and how that is going to wash up in New Zealand. And essentially, we're going to use that, or we're using that to calibrate a shock, if you like, to NZ SIM. And that'll tell us more about how changes in trade policies are going to sort of affect the New Zealand economy. And ultimately, it'll give us good insight into any sort of response from the official cash rate. Of course, I said in the speech, all models are wrong. Some are useful. Those are both very useful models. But, we're also monitoring. There's sort of been an explosion in work globally looking at the likely impacts of the trade war. So we're making sure that we're well across all of that and feeding it into our decision-making processes. And finally, we're monitoring, like looking across markets in very fine detail to sort of figure out how this thing is evolving, and then we sort of compare that with what's coming out of our models and sort of use that to see what are we missing, what can we sort of add into the mix to make our projections more accurate. So plenty of work going on in this space, and obviously we look forward to bringing you some of that in our May monetary policy statement, which I think is out on the 28th, towards the end of the month.
Thanks, Paul. How can you forecast the impact of trade policy changes when policy seems to change day by day? For example, the 90-day pause on tariffs and the exception to electronics in the US. It's not easy. And I think a lot of people globally are struggling with these changes. I think it's well, first of all, uncertainty. We can think about uncertainty and what does that uncertainty mean for an optimal monetary policy response. There's different types of uncertainty, and it has different effects on sort of optimal policy. So we're doing some work on that as well. We've got a lot of sort of understanding of that already, but we're just sort of refreshing that in light of the global trade shock. I also think it's a matter of there comes a time where you've just sort of got to draw a line in the sand, and I think what President Trump sort of put out before the partial pause, hopefully it's a worst case scenario. So, we could model a worst case scenario and sort of see what that looks like and then compare it to the current scenario, and it sort of gives us an idea of the impact that sort of variations on trade barriers would have in terms of New Zealand's economic performance and in terms of the optimal monetary policy response. So just to summarise, understanding uncertainty and sort of understanding worst case scenarios, as well as the current scenario for as long as it lasts, are going to be crucial going forward for us.
Thanks, Paul. Question from Kelly Eckholt. The forecasts are also reliant on a technical assumption for the exchange rate that is usually not consistent with long-term equilibrium concepts. How do you reconcile the view that the OCR profile is an unbiased view on how the OCR will change with the fact it's unlikely the exchange rate will remain unchanged?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Kelly. Our technical assumption for the exchange rate in our projections is we just project it as a straight line. So the exchange rate over the next few years is going to be what it was yesterday or the day we put out the projection. So clearly that isn't going to be the case, especially at the moment. The exchange rate's been all over the place, although in terms of change from last projection, it's sort of bounced back to where it was. So it kind of gets to my point that the OCR track is endogenous, and I said the projection, it's always going to change in some way, and the exchange rate is a very obvious example of what that change could look like. So the exchange rate almost by definition is different than what we projected every time we come to project, and if it's a bit lower, then that kind of implies more inflationary pressures and a sort of upward slant to that OCR projection. We've done, I think it's pretty well established that it's very difficult to forecast exchange rates and asset prices, more generally. So I think it's a reasonable assumption, that straight line. Oh, it's not. I mean, obviously it isn't going to happen, but it's a convenient shortcut for us instead of pretending that we can forecast the exchange rate. But I'd just put it in that bucket of issues. As the facts change, we change our mind. So yeah, it's just one of those things.
Another question from Kelly. Have you done any analysis on how your new GDP Nowcast performs compared to other Nowcast models?
Yes, we've looked at other Nowcast models. I think you guys have got one there. Westpac has got one. I haven't looked at that for a while, but we've done work on our forecasts, how our forecasts compare to others, and we are pretty good at it. We did that as part of our 5-yearly review of monetary policy to the end of 2022. We're doing it currently for our next review, and we'll publish on that. I should say we're required by legislation to do a review at least every 5 years, so we're sort of always doing that. So yeah, I know that our projections perform pretty well. This is the projections that's in the MPS, and they're not always the same as just what's coming out of the Nowcasting technology. So there's people in the mix as well. But I think we're pretty confident about how we stack up as a forecaster across New Zealand. I don't know specifically about we would have looked at how well our Nowcast performs. Oh, actually, and in fact, in one of the analytical notes, there's a lot in there about whether the Nowcast performs better than the actual published forecasts for GDP, and the forecasts, the circumstances in which the forecasts are better, and the circumstances in which the Nowcast is just as good. So have a look in there. We give that a good sort of airing in one of those analytical notes.
Thanks, Paul. A quick question from Sean Keane. What day and time will the GDP Nowcast be published each week?
Okay, I don't think that's a state secret. My understanding, Sean, is that we will be updating that on Friday afternoons.
I think it's 3 p.m, but we'll confirm that.
Okay, 3 p.m. Friday afternoon, to be confirmed. And it's cool, Sean. You should have a look. I know you will, but you can see the effect of all the data that came out that week and the impact that it's had on our Nowcast for GDP. So very, very transparent. Very interesting watching that Nowcast evolve as we sort of get more and more data relating to economic activity over the quarter.
And that's live on our website now.
Yeah,
so
I believe so. Yeah.
An anonymous question. At the recent Monetary Policy Conference, Ben Bernanke suggested central banks should publish multiple economic scenarios and possible policy responses, not just the central forecast. What do you think of that idea?
Well, Ben Bernanke said it, so it's got to be a good idea, right? In the past, the Reserve Bank has published alternative scenarios, not for some time. I think when I first worked here in the late 90s, we were doing that fairly regularly, but I think we haven't done that yet since I've been here, which is coming up for 3 years now. There's issues around that. It's sort of how do you communicate uncertainty? And this speech is partly about communicating that uncertainty. Like, I'm very open to it. We'll have a think about it. Maybe this global trade war is an opportunity for us to publish a scenario on a worst case scenario. That's not a promise, but yeah, that's something that we'll think about between now and May 28.
And another anonymous question. What does the media most frequently get wrong about forecasting? And how can we better describe or use the forecasts?
Yeah, first of all, we're blessed to have some really good journalists out there. So don't get me wrong. There's been a few op-eds that I just look at and go, oh my goodness, that is just digital dust. It's clickbait, and it's in mainstream media, which is all the weirder. So it's like some journalists are just nailing it every time. But others, more kind of op-ed style journalism, I think is just, well, as I said, I think it's misinformation. We are all about having the conversation. Like, we want to be having the conversation. We learn from what other people think about what we do. It's very important to us. But it has to be a serious conversation. There has to be something there that we can sort of grab onto, and we'll respond. Like, let's talk about this stuff. But as I said, it has to be serious. There's stuff out there that is just, yeah, it's wrong in so many ways. It's so full of holes that there's actually nothing.
Right, a question from Satish Ranchod. Are you looking at a Nowcast model for CPI?
The ones we're publishing today, as I mentioned, is investment, residential investment and house prices, as well as Kiwi GDP. I don't know, Satish. I'll find out and I'll let you know. I don't think it's on the agenda, although we've got very clever people in the forecasting team and the modelling team. Actually, a lot of this is coming out of the modelling team, so one of them may well be cooking that up off the side of their desk.
Another question from Sean Keane. One of the most frequent criticisms of central banks is that they are always slow to respond to demand and inflation conditions that the markets have already priced in. Is your expectation that the use of this new Nowcasting tool will make the OCR more responsive more quickly to changing economic conditions?
Not really. Like, as I said, we've been doing this internally for some time. It's not a new thing for us. We've got our so-called monitoring quarters, the current and the next one. It's not a huge change. In terms of the technology we use, we're just sort of putting a bit of it out there, in the interests of transparency. I'm not sure how true that is, Sean, about central banks being slow to respond to markets. There's the old joke that Adrian used to roll out about markets predicting 3 of the next 10 downturns, or whatever. So markets, they tend to be a bit more volatile than policy announcements coming out of central banks. Some of that will be, value adding, and some of it will just be wrong and sort of gets corrected. I'm not sure. And as I mentioned, like, a lot of there's financial market information that goes into our various nowcasts. So I like to think that we're monitoring markets, and there is a lot for us to learn to pick up from markets, particularly if our reaction function is well understood. It's useful.
A question from Hamish Pepper. Are there situations where it's appropriate for the OCR forecast to not purely be an endogenous output, but also include some judgment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's right. It's still endogenous. Our process is that we start with a projection that includes an OCR forecast that is driven primarily by the model. and it's a model-driven OCR forecast, so it's imperfect. It's not. It's well imperfect, but it's a starting point. And as we go through forecast week, which is a really rigorous, intensive period for us, the Monetary Policy Committee will sort of overlay judgment onto that OCR track and the projections more broadly. We're under no illusion that just because it comes out of a sophisticated empirical model, that it's the truth in any sense of the word. So I sort of talked about that. There's people in the mix, expert judgment coming from the team in the economics department and more broadly across the bank, and obviously from the Monetary Policy Committee. But even if we do change that OCR track up a bit for sort of representing sort of expertise around the table, strategic issues, whatever, we'll still run it back through NZ Sim. So then you'll get little small movements in consumption or investment and all that sort of stuff. So it's still consistent. It's still a coherent, consistent OCR track, but it's not. It's model supported, not model driven.
Another question from Satish. The RB's forecasts typically note that tradables inflation can't be relied on to drive the inflation, but tradables has a larger influence on the inflation cycle and drives a lot of the surprise relative to forecasts. Are you going to focus more on this area, especially given the current global shock?
Well, yeah, I mean, interesting question. Like tradables tends to be more volatile than non-tradables, obviously beyond our control. But I mentioned the monitoring we're doing to assess how this trade shock is going to play out, and obviously looking at tradables inflation in detail, in sort of micro market detail, is going to be important in terms of how that washes up in the New Zealand economy. So yes, absolutely, we will be looking at that. Well, we are looking at that with a under the microscope currently.
A question from Mark Brown. Can you explain how the MPC make decisions when you are faced with times when you have a base case scenario but a significant skew of risks in one direction?
Yeah, that's interesting question. That gets down to what's our strategy, what's the Monetary Policy Committee's strategy, and ideally risks are kind of balanced across our macro variables, but sometimes there's significant downside risk. And I think COVID is a great example of that. Those sort of early years of COVID, huge downside risks to the New Zealand economy, and the Monetary Policy Committee of the time implemented a least regrets framework, sort of saying what's the outcome that we most want to avoid, which in that case was a deep depression and deflation in the New Zealand economy. So the skew of risks, the balance of risks, it does feed into MPC decisions and MPC strategy. And there's actually, again, the sort of academic community are looking at that COVID period in detail, and you can sort of think of it as insurance. There was a paper presented at our conference a few weeks ago now by an Australian academic making the case that it's optimal for central banks to sort of take out a bit of insurance in ensuring that those worst case scenarios don't occur.
Another question from Kelly. The G-cubed model should probably tell you the NZD should depreciate given the shock. Is that what you see?
I'm not going to tell you that, Kelly Eckhold. Not yet, anyway.
Thanks. A question from John O'Mitchell at NBR. Hi, Paul. Can you give examples you've seen of the misinformation in media about the RBNZ forecasting?
Not really, Jonathan. Legit question, but I don't want to give it oxygen, to be honest. I just want to have a serious conversation with New Zealanders, and the media is fundamental in that. So let's go.
Another anonymous question. Forecasting, particularly of aggregate supply, has been particularly difficult over recent years. Have you considered publishing more confidence intervals around forecasts to communicate and quantify your level of uncertainty with them?
We have, and sometimes we do put an error band around it. We've got these error bands. Again, it's sort of that topic of how do we what's the best way to communicate uncertainty. And like yes is the answer. We will do that. It can be a bit sort of horrifying sometimes how wide those confidence intervals are, just given the nature of economic data. It's not physics that we're doing here, it's about human behaviour. So, I sort of struggle to predict what I'm going to be doing in a couple of weeks' time, never mind what all of New Zealand is going to be doing in 3 years' time. So, how do we communicate that? And I think wrapping error bands around projections is useful, is one useful way of communicating that uncertainty.
Okay, we're just about out of questions. I think we're going to wrap up unless there are any further coming in. Final question, what would have happened to the New Zealand economy, growths, jobs and so on if you tried to rein in New Zealand inflation too fast?
Oh, that was I talked about that in the speech, the flexible bit of our inflation targeting mandate. It's actually in our remit. Like we are required, yes, the kind of headline is required to keep inflation at the midpoint of that target band, within the 1 to 3 target band with a focus on the 2%. But then there's a bunch of secondary considerations around avoiding unnecessary volatility in employment, the exchange rate growth, etc., etc. So, we're sort of always trying to find the sweet spot in between getting that headline result without sort of inducing unnecessary volatility into the economy. It's an inexact science, absolutely. But if we were to throw the OCR around, just given every shock to try and keep inflation at 2%, by next Tuesday, you would see huge volatility in the exchange rate. You would see way more volatility in the real economy. It wouldn't be optimal. Like ideally, you sort of tie that back to well-being, which is ultimately what we're about, is improving the well-being of New Zealanders. That's sort of challenging. There's academics that have a poke at it from time to time, but as I said, it's an inexact science, and we really do strive. We explicitly talk about it. We explicitly talk about those secondary considerations of avoiding unnecessary volatility in our record of meeting. So it's very much a consideration. Avoiding that unnecessary volatility when we're making OCR decisions.
Right, another quick one has come in from George Henderson. Have macro models updated since the supply side shock of COVID, and are there judgment overlays you may make for future supply shocks?
Yeah, like part of our review that we did of monetary policy in the 5 years to end 2022, we identified that we needed to understand the supply side of the economy a bit better. Prior to that, it was sort of the supply side evolved sort of gradually. It was a slow-moving beast. It didn't really inject sort of volatility into our measure of excess capacity in the economy. So, we didn't have to pay it all that much attention. Obviously, as you mentioned, that changed over COVID. It's not that... there's a whole bunch of other economists, less in the monetary policy space, that have been looking at supply side issues, productivity, labour market stuff, et cetera, and sort of that is sort of coming more and more into the monetary policy space. So, the global community of economists, we're constantly evolving these models to give us a better idea of what's going on. And these days, that includes a better understanding of the supply side, not just COVID. There's elements of this tariff shock, very much so, that are on the supply side of the economy, climate change, weather events, etc. Cyclone Gabrielle from a couple of years ago, that's all about the supply side. So we're doing lots of work to integrate what we're learning about the supply side into our sort of Workhorse NZSIM, New Zealand inflation model. So that's a lot of work's going on in that space. It's good, useful, beneficial work that ultimately will improve how we do monetary policy. It's good for me because I've spent a lot of my career working on productivity stuff, and all of a sudden it's kind of front and centre in the monetary policy world.
Right, I think we're just about out of time now. The last question from Kelly.
Kelly, that's your fourth name.
From the recent conference you hosted was to not overreact to supply shocks. Is that an important consideration for this shock?
Yeah, I mean, not overreacting will be an important consideration for any shock. Don't overreact. As you were pinging on LinkedIn after our last decision, Kelly, you were going bravo, the RBNZ. It was kind of with the 25 that we did last week. Cool heads, steady hand on the tiller, all that kind of stuff. That's very much the vibe around the NPC table currently. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Paul. We've finished the questions.
All right.
10:25. So
okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Read the speech, engage with it. Look forward to hearing what you think. Go well out there. Cheers. Ka kite.